Hi guys, this one's probably going to be a little bit sloppy because I'm just trying to throw it down on video, but I've been having a lot of generative conversations recently in this sort of where I think there's going to be a period of creativity before things get quiet again for a while. And I thought it might be nice to share. So bear with me if it's a bit of a random walk through stream of consciousness. The topic here is once again hitting on this thing, NFTs, but bringing in some other stuff. And hopefully making that a little bit more coherent or relevant why it is that I'm continuing to point my attention at that place. So the frame I'd like to put out is something like egregore design or egregore engineering. And the notion of egregore, I think, is a very powerful one. I'm not sure it's common knowledge. My understanding is that it's largely been sort of present or part of the vocabulary of, I think, the rationalist community. So people like the ones who are adjacent to Slate Star Codex and meditations on Moloch and whatnot. And so it's a little bit like a way of recapturing the meaning of notions like gods and angels and demons. Okay, so let's say we have a demon, a Canaanite demon, Moloch, or another one, Mammon. And we're gonna say, okay, we're gonna now say that term Moloch means something. And then Slate Star Codex goes through and I think quite beautifully illustrates what that means, right? So in this case, he articulates it as something like a sort of a quasi-agentic characteristic. It shows up as having a certain causal structure, having to do with some intrinsic incentive landscapes and kind of game theoretic dynamics that show up in certain kinds of systems. Right? So in the canonical example, you have something like there's a certain like story where we've got an island or a culture where the culture has two basic fundamental like axiomatic rules. One is everybody gives themselves a painful electric shock every day, and the second one is if anybody is discovered not to have given themselves a painful electric shock, they must be painfully murdered by other people. And so the idea is we all agree, anybody like over coffee, we can be like, man, I hate this sort of electric shock thing. But then we all kind of like shrug and say, oh, well, I guess that's just how it works, right? And it's like, how do we end up in a circumstance where we end up in these downward spirals where our kind of conscious, higher, more optimistic sensibilities point towards things that seem obviously stupid, and yet the constraints of our incentive landscapes and our coordination structures put us in downward spirals. So it's kind of like Moloch as a name for a phenomenon that happens in cultures in a certain way. All right. And what I want to suggest, this is the reason why this video is being created, is what I want to suggest is that certain kinds of media, and here I'm using the word broadly, so media and technology, frankly, somewhat synonymous, right? So certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of media, certain kinds of ways that humans can change the possibility landscape of the reality for culture, so certain kinds of architectures of culture have affordances, right? They provide, they sort of shape the landscape of culture in a way that creates a niche. And the niche is named in a way and becomes an egregore. So what I would say, for example, is that the egregore that we call Mammon is the name for the cultural niche, the kind of organism, the kind of cultural organism that evolves in a cultural niche that is the affordance of money, particularly tokenized money. So what does tokenized money do? Well, when I alienate wealth from complex relationality, I extract it from pure relationship and capacity, and I alienate it into an abstract object, whether it's a bar of gold or a Bitcoin, it doesn't matter, or a fiat dollar. The whole point is that whole milieu is the same kind of thing. New possibilities show up. For example, hoarding. And I can't hoard my ability to hunt. I can't hoard my capacity to nurture other people. It's like impossible intrinsically. I could in some sense, like gather lots of food and hoard that, but it spoils, right? So there's no grounding for it. But I can hoard gold if that gold now maps to more than just gold, right? If it has a utility as a symbol, as money, as opposed to just a pile of gold. Because if I just hoard a pile of gold, who cares? All right. The affordance of hoarding is now part of the behavior of a culture that has money, as is, by the way, avarice. Avarice has to do with two dynamics. One is both the possibility of hoarding, but also the increasing selective advantage that is conferred upon one who has successfully hoarded. And this is the increasing power of having asymmetric money, asymmetric wealth. And so if I happen to have, call it meaningfully more wealth than the average, if the Gini Pareto distribution, if I'm on the strong side of the Pareto distribution, the value of my money is actually more than in just its pro rata share. Right? So if I've got $100 and you've got $100, each dollar's worth 100. But I've got $10,000, you've got $100. My incremental dollars are actually worth more because my optionality is way off the charts, and I can do things like get money on money return. So avarice is a simultaneously a perception of that piece of the niche. Oh, wait, if I can become the one who has the most money, my power, relative power goes up, as well as the shape of the niche. Hope that's not too loud. If it is, I guess that's probably trying to film outside. So what I'm saying here is I'm providing a new architecture. That egregore is, we can look at it through both sides of the content context mirror. We can look at it as the content of the egregore, in the case of Mammon, things like a tendency towards hoarding and a tendency towards avarice and etc. But we can also look at it from the point of view of the niche that is created by the affordances of money. And then we can talk about the presencing or the agency of the egregore, is how the set of technologies, the set of media that gather around that object, presence the agency of that niche in the larger cultural environment. So what I mean is something like money's powerful. The ability of the level of coordination capacity that is afforded by money, the level of selective advantage that's afforded by the ability to create a store of value that lasts longer than things like food, the ability, the optionality that is afforded by the polymorphic characteristic of money, meaning that I can invest in a company, and even if the S curve of that company, I invest in Buggy Whip company, I can sell that before Buggy Whips become obsolete. Now it's moved back to money, which doesn't really care about Buggy Whips and obsolescence. It's much more abstract, which means I can redeploy the money in automotive, right? I can constantly kind of move. It's a very powerful location, very powerful. So one who begins to steer the agency of the technology complex that is the embodiment of the egregore of Mammon notices an actual increase in power. So Mammon becomes a dominant character. The egregore of Mammon is a dominant character in any culture that has money, simply because money is such a powerful tool. And Mammon becomes that one which is simultaneously most afforded by the presencing and penetration of money into the cultural field, which is to say the diversification and proliferation of the embodiment of Mammon, the fine graining and its increasing the agentic potential of money in the cultural field, and is the one that is the actual thing. It's defined by that field. Yeah, I would say now, by the way, by inclusion, and this is a little bit, Mammon feels very bright and easy to me. This is a little bit more of a stretch, but I like putting it out there, that Moloch is the egregore that is afforded by the institutional form in general. That's a powerful proposition. What I mean by institutional form is I'll invoke the distinction between instrument and institution that a guy named Carol Quigley put into my mind. So an instrument is something that furthers human agency, whereas an institution is what happens when an instrument simultaneously begins to have its own incentive structures, its own self-interest. So an instrument is when an institution, an institution is when an instrument begins to have a self of itself. And we've all kind of noticed this. A startup company is an instrument, right? It's a way of coordinating the agency of the individuals that allows them to be more effective collectively than apart. But as a startup company matures into a corporation, there's something about the corporation that begins to have an agency of its own that is separate from the intent and values of the individuals that participate in it, right? And individuals actually start becoming agents or cogs in the corporation. And that's, by the way, corporation, but pick your poison, right? Any institution, bureaucracy, school, government, hospital, all of it. That transition from instrument to institution, that transition of human from sovereign to agent is, I would propose, Moloch. The entire dynamic that Slate Star Codex articulates in the meditations on Moloch is defined as simultaneously the affordance that is provided by the power of the technology of the institutional form and the niche that falls in behind that, right? And this, I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but I think this is sort of an exercise for the readers to play back and forth with the description of the field of what is Moloch that is identified in that essay and the frame that I'm providing. Okay, now here's the punchline. Back to NFTs. Remember, we talk about affordances. We talk about how technologies afford new possibilities in culture, and these technologies create a niche that the organism or the ecosystem that fills that niche could be named as an egregore. And the capacity or the power of the set of technologies that are the embodiment of that egregore define its relationship to the broader culture. So now we have egregores competing with egregores is a big piece of what culture is. The proposition is that NFTs afford a radically new possibility space for egregores, other ones besides Mammon and Moloch, and in particular affords a new potential possibly for the conscious design or the willing invocation of egregores. So either hey, wouldn't it be nice to actually have these egregores be more powerful in our social culture so we can identify them and sort of, how do we upregulate that in the environment? Or what would it look like what would this new possibility look like? And we're going to create a new egregore. I'll give you an example. And I would propose, by the way, it's a very interesting object to consider, is the arc of our culture really been defined by the fact that say Moloch and Mammon have been the dominant egregores of the world that I've described as game A, where objects like money, and maybe we could add Mars, Ares into that equation, a small number of demons have been the dominant egregores, and that sort of defined the world that we've lived in because of the consequences that I've just described. Now, there's another one out there. Different lineages or different traditions name it differently. I'll use the name Michael, Archangel Michael. It might be nice to bring Archangel Michael into the game. One of the things Archangel Michael has in the story is a capacity to bring a higher degree of power in relationship with, say, for example, demons like Moloch and Mammon. Well, what might Archangel Michael look like? What is the egregore design that embodies that? And how might we use the novel technologies of NFTs and DAOs, blockchain in general, others if we feel like we need to, right? We're not limited to that particular toolbox, but those are good ones to be thinking about to properly create the niche that would be the embodiment of that particular egregore. And then, of course, to grow that niche and allow its power to begin to presence in our cultural milieu in conflict with these other egregores. And Michael's an example, a good one, maybe a very important one, but there are others. We can maybe think of Metatron as an interesting egregore, and others, of course, many, many. But that's the thought.